I used to believe that family was written in blood, that the veins running through our arms carried not only oxygen, but also the binding threads of loyalty, love, and belonging. But as I sit here on the old wooden porch of my house, the sun sinking low in the horizon, I watch my son, grown now, tall, handsome, confident, walking out the door, and I can't help but feel that gnawing question rise once more inside me. Is he really mine? Don't misunderstand me. I love him with every fiber of my being. I've loved him through scraped knees, broken bones, long nights of homework, and even longer nights of waiting up until he made it home safely. But the truth I never spoke out loud, is that from the very first moment I held him, I knew something was different. I am 72 years old now. At this age, most men I know have long retreated into the quiet. They read the morning paper, water their gardens, rock gently in their chairs as they fade into the last chapters of their lives. And yet, inside me, there has always been a storm, one I have carried for decades, one I chose to bear in silence. I was 28 when I married my wife. It was an autumn afternoon, golden leaves cascading down Main Street. She was radiant, the kind of beauty that makes a man forget the world for a moment. When she slipped her hand into mine at the altar, I felt like I'd won something far greater than any lottery. A year later, she told me she was pregnant. I remember that night vividly. I had just returned home from the sawmill, sweat still clinging to my shirt, my hands blistered from hauling planks of wood. She stood in the kitchen, her eyes shimmering, and whispered, "We're going to be parents." I laughed so loudly I startled the neighbor's dog. That night I lay awake imagining what our child would look like. Would he have my crooked smile, her delicate nose? Would he run to me shouting, "Dad," in that clumsy toddler voice that melts a man's heart? When the day finally came, I stood outside the delivery room, palms sweating, heart thundering in my chest. Then the nurse placed a tiny, wrinkled, red-skinned baby into my arms. My throat tightened. Tears rolled down my face before I even realized it. "I'll protect you," I whispered against his forehead, "for as long as I live." But even in that sacred moment, as I looked at his face, I noticed he didn't look like me. Now maybe you've been there before. Maybe you felt the sting of relatives making comments they thought were harmless, not knowing they were carving scars into your soul. Funny, my uncle once said at a family gathering, "The boy doesn't take after you at all." Another chuckled, "Must be all his mother's side." I laughed it off. I waved away the remarks with jokes of my own. But deep down, each word was a dagger. Each time someone pointed it out, the seed of doubt grew a little larger. I could have asked my wife. God knows there were nights I wanted to. But whenever the thought reached my lips, I'd look at her, her tired but content smile as she tucked him into bed, the tenderness with which she stroked his hair, and I swallowed the question. Instead, I worked, harder than ever, at the sawmill, at construction sites, driving trucks at night for extra cash. I swore he would never go without. My hands grew rough, my back bent, my eyes heavy with exhaustion, and every penny I earned I poured into his life. You see, that's the thing about fatherhood. Sometimes it isn't about the blood you share, but about the sacrifices you're willing to make. One evening when he was 6, he came running toward me holding a piece of paper. "Dad, look." He beamed. It was a drawing. Crude, colorful, a child's imagination splashed onto white paper. Two figures, a tall man and a little boy, holding hands under a bright blue sky. "That's you and me," he announced proudly. I grinned, my chest swelling with love. But then I noticed the detail that made me pause. The boy in the drawing had blue eyes, my wife and I both brown-eyed. I knelt, hugging him tight, praising his work. "It's beautiful, son," I said, choking on my words. Inside, though, the storm stirred again. "I want you to understand something. This story I'm telling you, it's not just about secrets and betrayal, it's about choice. It's about what a man does when faced with the unthinkable. Because here's the truth. I carried my doubts with me for years. Through every scraped knee I bandaged, every late-night science project, every baseball game where I cheered until my throat went raw. Each moment was real, each memory sacred. And yet, beneath them all was that question, heavy, suffocating. But instead of tearing me away from him, it only bound me closer. My silence was not weakness. It was love. There was a night years later when I almost told him. He was about 10 and we were in the garage building a model airplane together. His laughter filled the air as glue stuck to his fingers. He looked up at me with those eyes that weren't mine, and said, "You're the best dad ever." And I thought, what would happen if I told him the truth? Would those words still come out of his mouth? Would that smile vanish forever? So I stayed silent. Now, my friend, if you're still with me, you've probably felt the pull of this story. Maybe you've faced your own storm. Maybe you've carried secrets for the sake of love. If you have, then you know this isn't just my story. It's a story about fathers and sons everywhere, about the difference between being a father by blood and being a father by choice. That's why I'm asking you right now, if you feel something stirring in your heart, if you want to walk with me through the rest of this journey, hit that like button and make sure you subscribe, because the road ahead, it only gets heavier and I want you there with me. But let me leave you with this. The truth has a way of clawing its way out no matter how deep you bury it. And I always knew deep down that one day the truth about my son, about our family, would break free. I only prayed that when it did, I would have the strength to hold onto the one thing that mattered most, my love for him. Because love is stronger than blood. When my son was small, life seemed simple. The days were marked by school drop-offs, Saturday morning pancakes, and evenings spent chasing fireflies in the yard. If you had asked me then, I would have told you I was the luckiest man alive. But life has a way of whispering truths in the smallest, cruelest ways. It began with the little remarks. Family members, neighbors, even strangers at the grocery store. They didn't mean harm, I suppose, but every comment chipped at the fragile armor I had built around my heart. "Doesn't look like you at all," my cousin said once, tilting her head as though examining a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. "Must have taken after his mom." A neighbor laughed, ruffling my boy's hair. I'd smile, sometimes even chuckle. I had a whole arsenal of light-hearted answers. "He skipped my genes and got the better ones. Guess he's proof miracles exist." On the surface, I played the part of the proud father brushing off silly comparisons. But inside, every word echoed louder than the last. One afternoon, when he was around 8, we attended a family reunion at my brother's farm. The yard was alive with children shrieking, dogs barking, and the smell of barbecue drifting in the summer air. I remember sitting under the shade of an oak tree, a paper plate of ribs balanced on my lap, while my son played tag with his cousins. "Look at him," my brother said, pointing. "Runs fast, must get that from you." I smiled, grateful for once. But then my sister-in-law added casually, "Oh, I don't know, his hair's lighter, his nose is different, he doesn't really look like your side at all, does he?" The laughter that followed was harmless, at least to them. But for me, it was like a glass splinter lodged under my skin. I couldn't pull it out, and every movement made it hurt more. That night, when the house was quiet and my wife slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and wondered, why was it so easy for others to notice? Why did the thought never seem to cross my wife's mind? Or if it did, why did she never speak of it? I tried to shake it off by burying myself in work. My hands were my distraction. If I kept them busy, maybe my heart would stop aching. I worked late into the night, building furniture at the mill, sanding edges until my arms burned. During the day, I took side jobs repairing fences, patching roofs, anything that paid. And yet, even when I stumbled home exhausted, even when I collapsed into bed with splinters embedded in my palms, I found myself watching my son sleep. His chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, his small hand curled around a toy car or a baseball glove. He was mine in every way that mattered. Still, there were moments I couldn't ignore, like the time he was 10 and brought home a school project about family trees. He had drawn branches for each of us, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and placed himself proudly at the center. When he showed it to me, my chest swelled with pride. But then I noticed how he had drawn himself: fairer hair, a different nose, and those eyes, always those eyes. "Why'd you draw yourself like that?" I asked gently. He shrugged. "Because that's me, Dad. Simple, innocent. a child's answer, and yet it cut me deeper than any adult's careless remark. One evening, a bigger crack appeared in the fragile wall I had built around myself. It was a Saturday. We were all in the living room, my wife, my son, and I. The television hummed in the background, but I can't recall what was on. What I remember is my wife's laugh, bright and sudden, at something my son said. He looked at her with those unmistakable blue eyes, and for a fleeting second her smile faltered. It was so quick I almost doubted it happened. But I saw it, the way her hand froze midair, the way her gaze darted toward me before she composed herself. And in that instant I felt it, confirmation. Not proof, not evidence, but something in her eyes told me she knew. I could have confronted her. God knows I wanted to. I rehearsed the words in my head 1,000 times. Tell me the truth. Who is his father? Why didn't you trust me enough? But every time, I pictured my son's face, his laughter when I pushed him on the swing, the way he reached for me instinctively when he was scared of thunderstorms, the nights he fell asleep on my shoulder after begging for one more bedtime story. What would happen if I ripped that world apart? So I chose silence. Again. Silence, though, has its own weight. It builds like bricks on your chest until breathing itself feels like labor. There were nights I lay awake, my wife's breathing steady beside me, and wondered what kind of man I was. Was I strong for protecting him from the truth, or weak for being unable to demand it from her? And yet, whenever doubt threatened to drown me, I found my anchor in him. Like the night he played his first little league game. He struck out twice before finally connecting with the ball, sending it rolling down the field. He ran harder than I'd ever seen him run, his small legs pumping furiously, his face glowing with triumph. "Dad, did you see that?" He shouted after the game, running straight into my arms. In that moment, blood didn't matter. Genes didn't matter. He was my son, my boy, mine. Sometimes I think the universe tests us in whispers before it shouts. For years, the whispers came as comments, drawings, glances. For years, I ignored them, choosing instead to drown them out with love, with sacrifice, with the stubborn insistence that fatherhood is more than DNA. But deep down, I knew the shouting was coming. The truth was out there, waiting. And when it arrived, it would demand answers I wasn't sure I could give. So, I clung to the moments that made me proud. Teaching him to ride a bike, steadying the handlebars until he found his balance. Sitting at the kitchen table late at night, helping him wrestle through fractions. Cheering in the bleachers until my voice cracked. Each memory was another layer of cement, holding together the fragile house of my silence. But a house built on silence cannot stand forever. And I knew, though I never admitted it to anyone, that one day the walls would come crashing down. Work became the language I spoke best. While others chased careers, promotions, or dreams of travel, I chased only one thing: enough money to keep food on the table, shoes on my boy's feet, and a roof that wouldn't leak over his head. I used to think of work as a burden. Before he was born, I resented the long shifts at the mill, the sting of sawdust in my lungs, the endless hours hunched over rough planks. But once he arrived, work turned into something else entirely. It became my offering, my proof of love. Every splinter in my hand, every ache in my back was a silent prayer whispered over his life. "You will never want for anything if I can help it." The mill smelled of sweat, oil, and pine. I spent days there, my shirt sticking to my skin, my ears ringing with the shriek of saws. Nights I picked up side jobs, fixing fences, mending roofs, hauling furniture for neighbors who couldn't afford movers. There were mornings when I came home just as the sun was rising, my boots heavy with dust, my body desperate for sleep. And yet, the moment I saw him sitting at the table, swinging his little legs and waiting for breakfast, the exhaustion slipped away. He would grin, holding up his schoolwork. "Dad, can you help me with this?" How could I ever say no? I'd wash the grime from my hands, sit beside him, and trace fractions or spelling words with fingers that still smelled faintly of sawdust. He'd lean into me, sometimes falling asleep against my arm before finishing his homework. Those moments, quiet, ordinary, were what made all the sacrifices worth it. One summer evening when he was about 9, I decided it was time to teach him to ride a bike. We took the old red bicycle from the garage. its paint chipped from years of use. I steadied it as he climbed on, his legs trembling with excitement. "Don't let go, Dad," he shouted. "I won't, I promised." At first he wobbled, the handlebars jerking left and right as I jogged behind, my hands gripping the seat. His sneakers scraped the ground, his eyes wide with fear and determination. Then came the moment, every father knows it when you let go. I released my grip and he sailed forward on his own, pedaling furiously, unaware I was no longer holding on. When he finally noticed, he turned, his face breaking into the purest smile I'd ever seen. "I did it, Dad." The words echoed in my heart, reverberating louder than the cheers of any crowd. And yet, even in that joy, something gnawed at me. His face in the sunlight, those sharp features, those eyes the color of the summer sky, reminded me again of what I had always feared. He didn't look like me, not even a little. I kept that thought buried the way a man buries a nail too deep in wood. You don't see it anymore, but you know it's there. Instead, I chose to measure fatherhood in sweat, not blood. I remember the winter when he wanted a baseball glove. Money was tight. Work at the mill slowed down and I was already behind on bills, but I couldn't bear to see his disappointment, so I picked up double shifts. I drove trucks at night, hauling crates until my vision blurred. I patched roofs in the cold, my fingers numb beneath torn gloves. On Christmas morning, he tore open the wrapping paper and gasped when he saw the glove. "Dad, it's perfect." He slipped it on, the leather still stiff, and ran to the yard to toss a ball with me even as snowflakes fell around us. His laughter rang in the air, brighter than any carol. I watched him then, my heart swelling. He was my son, mine. But later, when he ran inside to show his mother, I lingered alone in the snow, staring at the glove in his hand. The thought crept back, uninvited, like frost crawling across glass, whose blood runs in his veins. There were nights I sat in the garage after everyone else had gone to bed. The air smelled of oil and dust, the faint hum of the refrigerator echoing in the dark. I'd look at the shelves where his old toys sat, a worn teddy bear, a set of toy cars missing their wheels, a stack of baseball cards. And I'd ask myself, was I enough? If the world found out he wasn't mine, would all of this, the toys, the games, the sleepless nights, would they still count? Or would people laugh, say I had been nothing more than a fool raising another man's child? The questions hurt, but each time I found my answer in him. Because fatherhood, I realized, wasn't about being seen as enough. It was about being there over and over again, no matter what doubts whispered in the dark. There was one night in particular I will never forget. He was 11, and he had a history project due the next day. He had forgotten until after dinner, and panic set in. Papers flew, pencils snapped, and tears brimmed in his eyes. "Dad, I can't do it," he cried, slamming the book shut. I pulled up a chair, weary from a 14-hour shift. "We'll do it together." We stayed up past midnight, piecing together the project with maps, timelines, and scribbled notes. By the end, he was asleep on the table, his cheek pressed against the paper. I carried him to bed, tucking the blanket under his chin. As I closed the door, I glanced at the project still spread out on the table. It wasn't perfect, but it was his, and it was ours. In that quiet moment, I knew something unshakable. No test, no DNA, no whisper of gossip could erase the truth of who I was to him. I was his father. Still, the storm inside me never disappeared. Every time someone commented on his looks, every time I caught a fleeting glance in the mirror and realized we shared nothing physical, it stirred again. Some nights, I wondered if I was lying to myself, if I was building a house of love on a foundation of silence that would one day collapse. But then I'd hear his voice calling Dad, or feel his hand slip into mine, or see his eyes, blue though they were, light up when I walked into the room. And the storm would quiet just for a little while. Life went on like that. A rhythm of work and love, doubt and devotion. A balancing act between the truth I suspected and the life I chose to protect. I didn't know then how close the storm was to breaking, how soon the whispers would turn into shouts. For now I worked. I loved. I stayed. Because at the end of every day, no matter what my blood said when he looked at me and called me Dad, I believed it, and maybe that was enough. There are moments in life that arrive quietly, like a knock at the door you almost don't hear. And yet, once you open it, nothing is ever the same again. For me, that moment came on an ordinary Thursday night. The day had been long at the mill, the kind of day where every board seemed heavier than the last, every machine louder, every hour stretched thin. When I walked through the door, my body ached in every bone, but the sound of laughter lifted me. My son was at the kitchen table, bent over a science kit trying to build something that looked halfway between a rocket and a birdhouse. "Dad, look," he said, holding up a crooked contraption of wires and glue. I smiled, setting my lunch pail down. "That's impressive." He laughed. "It's supposed to light up. Then we'll make it light up." And just like that, exhaustion melted into the background. That's how it always was with him. No matter how broken I felt, his presence stitched me back together. Later that night, after he went to bed, my wife and I sat in the living room. The television hummed softly in the background, but neither of us was really watching. She was knitting, a habit she had picked up over the years, her needles clicking in rhythm. I don't know what sparked it. Maybe it was the way the lamp cast shadows across her face, or maybe it was the tiredness loosening her tongue. But out of nowhere she said something that froze me. "He's nothing like you," she murmured, almost to herself. The words hung in the air like smoke. I turned slowly. "What do you mean?" Her eyes flicked up, startled. She fumbled, knitting needles, pausing midair. "I just mean his personality. He's so different, more carefree." But her voice wavered, and I knew. My heart pounded as if trying to break free from my chest. I wanted to demand the truth, to pull it out of her like a thorn buried too deep. The question trembled on my lips. Is he mine? But then I thought of my son asleep upstairs, his small body curled beneath the blanket, breathing softly, trusting the world to keep him safe. If I asked the question, if she answered, what would happen to him? So I swallowed the words. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of my wife's breathing. But in my mind everything was chaos. Her slip of the tongue wasn't proof, not yet. But it was confirmation of what I had feared for years. She was hiding something. I remembered the way she looked when she held our son as a baby, protective, almost possessive. The way she sometimes avoided my eyes when people commented on his appearance. The way she always changed the subject if conversation drifted too close to questions of family resemblance. It all added up now. The pieces fit. And yet, knowing wasn't the same as admitting. In the days that followed, I found myself watching her more closely, watching them both. At dinner, I'd catch her glancing at him with a mixture of pride and guilt. At school events, when other parents joked about how kids looked like their fathers, she would laugh too quickly, her eyes never meeting mine. The silence between us grew heavier. Not hostile, not loud, but thick, like fog you can't see through. And still I said nothing. One Sunday afternoon I almost broke. We had gone to church, as we always did, and afterward we stood in the parking lot chatting with neighbors. Someone mentioned how much their daughter looked like her father, and I saw my wife's jaw tighten. On the drive home, the silence pressed down until I thought I might suffocate. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, and finally whispered, "Do you have something to tell me?" Her head snapped toward me, eyes wide. "What do you mean?" My voice trembled. "About him." For a long moment she didn't answer. The car filled with the hum of the tires on asphalt. Then quietly she said, "No, nothing." But her voice cracked on the last word, and that was answer enough. That night I sat in the garage alone, surrounded by the relics of our life, his old toys, his first bike, the baseball glove I had worked double shifts to buy. I turned them over in my hands, each one a testament to years of love and sacrifice. If she had lied, if the blood in his veins wasn't mine, did any of it matter? The anger rose like fire in my chest. Anger at her for deceiving me. Anger at myself for not seeing sooner. Anger at the world for making love so complicated. But when I closed my eyes, all I saw was him. His laugh when I pushed him on the swing. His tears when he scraped his knee. The way he whispered thanks, Dad, after I stayed up all night helping with homework. And the anger broke apart, leaving only sorrow. Here's what I realized in that moment. Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes it chains you tighter. I could demand answers. I could force her to admit what I already suspected. But then what? Would I stop being his father? Would all those years vanish, erased because of something written in blood instead of love? No. So I made a choice. A deliberate, defiant choice. I would love him anyway. Not because he carried my blood, maybe he didn't. Not because she had been honest with me, she hadn't. But because every moment of his life had been built on my love, my sacrifice, my presence. And I refused to let a secret destroy that. Still, the choice didn't erase the pain. There were nights I lay awake beside my wife, wondering who he belonged to, whose eyes he had inherited, whose smile curved his lips. Was the man still out there, living his life, unaware that a boy bore his blood? The thought made me sick, and yet in the quiet of those nights I always came back to the same truth. No matter where he came from, he was mine, not by birth maybe, but by bond, by the thousand little ways we had chosen each other day after day. You might think love makes secrets easier to bear. It doesn't. Love makes them heavier, because you know the truth could destroy everything you've built. But still, I chose silence. And I told myself again and again, blood doesn't make a father, love does. Even as the storm gathered, even as the cracks in the wall widened, I held onto that truth with both hands, because I knew someday soon the storm would break. And when it did, I would need every ounce of strength to hold onto him. Family gatherings are supposed to be filled with warmth. At least that's what people like to believe. They picture laughter over roasted ham, children running barefoot through the grass, old stories retold with the same familiar punchlines. But sometimes family gatherings are where the ugliest truths slip out. It was my sister's birthday. She had insisted on hosting the whole clan at her place, a sprawling house out in the country. By late afternoon, the yard was crowded with cars, the porch decorated with balloons, the tables groaning under the weight of casseroles and cakes. I brought a bottle of wine, my wife carried a pie, and our son, 15 now, lanky and tall, trailed behind, earbuds dangling, only half present. "Smile, son," I said, nudging him. "It won't be that bad." He rolled his eyes, but a smirk tugged at his lips. For a while it was fine. We mingled, we ate, we swapped stories. I sat with my brothers on the porch, sipping sweet tea, watching the kids toss a football in the yard. The sun was golden, the kind of light that makes you forget the heaviness waiting in the shadows. And then, as it so often does, one careless comment shattered the peace. We were sitting around the long dining table, the birthday cake waiting at the center, candles unlit. My son had just leaned over to tell a joke, something goofy, but it had everyone laughing. That's when my cousin, half drunk and loose-tongued, smirked and said, "Funny kid, but really, who does he take after? Sure isn't you." The room quieted just a little, enough for me to hear the clink of forks on plates. I chuckled stiffly. Guess he's his own man. But my cousin wasn't done. He leaned back in his chair, eyes glinting with the kind of cruelty that masquerades as humor. "Nah, come on, look at him. Those eyes, that jawline, he doesn't look a thing like you. Everyone's thought it, we just never said it." Laughter rippled down the table, nervous and sharp. I froze. My son looked confused, glancing from face to face. My wife's face went pale. She lowered her eyes to her plate, hands trembling around her fork. That silence from her, that was worse than the words themselves. Because silence, in moments like these, is its own kind of confession. Heat flooded my chest. My fingers clenched so tightly around my glass I thought it might shatter. I wanted to stand, to roar at him, to tell every last one of them to shut their mouths. But my son was watching me, his eyes wide, waiting for me to lead. So I forced a smile, my jaw aching. "Family jokes," I said lightly, though my voice cracked. "Don't pay them any mind, son." But inside, something was breaking. The rest of the evening blurred. I laughed when I had to, nodded when spoken to, but it all felt like I was underwater, the voices muffled, the air too heavy. When the candles were lit and the cake cut, my son leaned close. "Dad, what was that about?" I put a hand on his shoulder. "Nothing you need to worry about." But the look in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. Seeds of doubt had been planted. And once planted, doubt has a way of growing, no matter how much you try to starve it. Later, when the night wound down, I found my wife in the kitchen helping with dishes. She wouldn't look at me. Her hands shook as she dried a plate. "Say something," I whispered, my voice raw. She froze. "What do you want me to say?" "The truth," I hissed. Her eyes darted toward the living room where voices still carried. "Not here," she murmured. "Please." That was all she said, but it was enough, because in that pleading tone I heard guilt, I heard fear, and I knew. The drive home was silent. My son sat in the back seat, music blasting through his earbuds, his gaze fixed on the window. My wife stared straight ahead, her face pale in the glow of the dashboard. I gripped the steering wheel, the muscles in my forearms straining. In my head, I replayed every moment of that dinner, every laugh at my expense, every sideways glance at my boy, and her silence, her damning silence, echoed the loudest of all. I had never felt so humiliated, not just for me but for him, because he didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve to be the punchline of their suspicions, the subject of whispers and cruel jokes. He was just a boy who wanted to belong, who wanted his family to see him for who he was, not who he wasn't. That night, long after he went to bed, I sat alone in the garage again. The shadows seemed heavier, pressing in on me. I picked up his old baseball glove from the shelf, the one I had worked myself raw to buy, and turned it over in my hands. "Who are you?" I whispered to the leather as if it might answer. "Who are you really?" Tears stung my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Men of my generation didn't cry, not where anyone could see. But the ache inside me was unbearable, a mix of betrayal, anger, and love so fierce it threatened to tear me apart. If I had been a different kind of man, maybe I would have walked away that night, packed a bag, left the lies behind. But I couldn't. Because upstairs my son was sleeping. He was dreaming dreams a boy should dream, of baseball games and school dances, not of secrets and betrayals. And I couldn't be the one to shatter that for him. So I stayed. I stayed because love isn't always about what's easiest. Sometimes it's about what you choose to carry, even when the weight breaks your back. The next morning I walked into the kitchen to find him eating cereal. He looked up at me, his spoon pausing halfway to his mouth. "Dad," he said slowly, "why did Uncle say that last night?" My heart pounded. I forced myself to smile. "People talk, son. Sometimes they say things without thinking, but you listen to me, none of it matters. You're my boy, always have been, always will be." He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded, but I could see it in his eyes. The doubt had already taken root, and no matter how much I tried, I couldn't unplant it. That was the night I realized the storm wasn't just coming. It was already here. And sooner or later, the truth, whatever it was, would break us wide open. Life has a way of dragging the truth into the light at the worst possible moments. You can spend years building walls of silence, convincing yourself you're protecting what matters most. But all it takes is one unexpected crisis, one twist of fate, and those walls collapse in an instant. For us, it began with a doctor's visit. My son was 17 when he fainted during basketball practice. I remember the phone call vividly, the coach's voice tight with urgency, the screech of tires as I raced to the hospital, my heart thundering louder than the engine. When I burst through the ER doors, I saw him lying on a gurney, pale, wires snaking across his chest. "Dad," he whispered, his voice hoarse but steady. I squeezed his hand, forcing a smile. "I'm here, son. You're going to be okay." The doctors assured me it wasn't life-threatening, but they wanted to run more tests just to be safe. They suspected a heart condition. "We'll need to check family history," the physician said, flipping through a clipboard. "Are there any known conditions on your side?" My throat tightened. I rattled off what I knew: my father's high blood pressure, my uncle's cholesterol issues. But as I spoke, I noticed the doctor's frown deepen. "Sometimes genetic markers don't show until adolescence," he explained. "It might be useful to run DNA testing to better tailor treatment." DNA. The word hit me like a hammer. I nodded stiffly. "Whatever you need to do, just help him." My wife was beside me, clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles went white. She didn't say a word. The tests were run. We waited. Days stretched like years. I busied myself fixing things around the house, sanding a chair that didn't need sanding, mowing the lawn twice. Anything to keep from thinking about what was coming. And then the results arrived. We sat in a small consultation room, sterile and suffocating. The doctor placed a file on the desk, his expression careful. "There's no major condition," he said. Relief flooded me, but the genetic analysis revealed something unusual. My palms grew damp. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then spoke gently as though his words were glass that might shatter us. "Mr. Thompson, the test results show that you and your son are not biologically related." The room fell silent. I stared at him, unable to breathe. My wife gasped softly, her face draining of color. My son's eyes darted between us, confusion clouding his features. "What does that mean?" The doctor cleared his throat. "It means your DNA does not match. He is not your biological child." The words crashed over me like a tidal wave. I had braced for them all my life, in whispers, in doubts, in stolen glances. But hearing them spoken aloud was something else entirely. My wife shook her head violently. "There must be a mistake. Run it again." The doctor's voice was calm, unshaken. "We checked twice. The results are conclusive." My son's voice cracked. "Mom, Dad," I couldn't speak. My throat closed, my chest heaved. All I could do was stare at him, the boy I had raised, the boy I had loved beyond measure, and feel the ground vanish beneath me. That night the house was filled with silence sharp enough to cut skin. My son locked himself in his room. My wife sat at the kitchen table, staring at her hands, whispering prayers I couldn't hear. And me? I walked into the garage, closed the door, and collapsed into the old chair. The truth was out. After all these years, it was no longer suspicion, no longer a shadow. It was fact, cold, unforgiving. I buried my face in my hands and wept. The next day, word spread. Family has a way of sharing secrets faster than wildfire. My sister called, her voice trembling with false sympathy. "We heard about the test. Oh, Harold, how could she?" My cousin's message was crueler. "Guess we were right all along." Neighbors whispered. Friends looked at me differently. The humiliation was unbearable. At the grocery store, I caught two women staring at us, murmuring behind their hands. My son walked ahead, shoulders stiff, pretending not to notice. I wanted to shield him, to scream at them, but all I could do was endure. At home, the tension was unbearable. My son avoided me as though he didn't know whether to call me dad anymore. My wife tried to speak, her eyes red from crying, but I turned away. I wasn't ready. Everywhere I looked, I saw betrayal. In her silence, in his confused gaze, in the echoes of every family gathering where I had laughed off the jokes. All those years I had carried the doubt alone, and now the world carried it with me. One evening he finally confronted me. We were sitting in the living room, the air heavy. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, his voice trembling. "Dad, is it true?" I swallowed hard. "The tests say so." His face crumpled. "So I'm not your son." The words broke me. I stood, crossing the room, gripping his shoulders. "Listen to me, you are my son. Nothing changes that." But his voice cracked. "Everyone's saying." "Let them say what they want," I interrupted, tears brimming. "I don't care what any paper says. I've been there since the day you were born. I've loved you every moment of your life. That makes you mine." He stared at me, searching for truth. Slowly, his eyes filled with tears. He collapsed into my arms, sobbing against my chest. And in that moment I knew, no matter what the world said, no matter what the tests showed, I would not let this secret destroy us. But the damage was done. My wife's silence screamed louder than any words. She still hadn't admitted the truth outright, hadn't told me who the real father was, and maybe I didn't want to know. But her betrayal hung in the air, a poison we all breathed. I loved my son with everything I had, but the storm wasn't over. This was only the beginning. Because now the whole world knew. And once the world knows, it never lets you forget. When news spreads in a family, it spreads like wildfire, fast, merciless, and impossible to contain. The DNA test had been the match, and now every corner of my world was in flames. It started with whispers, a phone call here, a text message there. By the end of the week, everyone knew. My son wasn't mine. I walked into church that Sunday, as I always did, with my wife at my side and my son trailing just behind. But the looks we received told me the truth. We were no longer a family in their eyes. Eyes darted away when I met them. Conversations hushed as I passed. Some people offered thin, pitying smiles. Others didn't bother to hide their judgment. I gripped the Bible tighter in my hand, forcing myself not to react. My son kept his head down, his shoulders hunched as though trying to disappear. My wife clutched her purse, her face pale and tight. I wanted to shout, to tell them all to look away, to leave us alone. But instead I sat in the pew, my jaw clenched, and endured. The whispers grew louder at home. Family members who once filled our house with laughter now called only to ask questions, to poke at wounds. "How could she lie to you like that?" my sister demanded over the phone. "You can't keep raising someone else's child," my cousin scoffed. "It's not right." Even my brother, my own brother, leaned close one night after a family dinner and said, "You've done enough, Harold. It's time to walk away. Let the boy find his real father." I stared at him, stunned. "He is my real son," but he shook his head. "No, he isn't." The words cut deeper than any blade. At home, the storm raged. My wife tried again and again to speak. One evening, she fell to her knees in the kitchen, tears streaming down her face. "Harold, please, please forgive me. I was young, I was scared, I didn't know what to do." Her sobs filled the room, but I stood frozen. "You lied to me," I whispered, "for 17 years. I thought I would lose you," she cried. "I thought if you knew you'd leave, and you loved him so much, I couldn't take that away from him or from you." Her hands reached for mine, trembling, desperate, but I pulled back. The betrayal was too raw, too deep. And then there was my son. He avoided me for days after the news broke. I'd find him sitting on the porch, staring into the distance, or hiding in his room with music blasting through his headphones. One night I found him sitting in the dark living room, his knees pulled to his chest. "Son," I said softly, stepping closer. He looked up at me, his eyes wet with tears. "Dad, am I still your son?" The question shattered me. I sat down beside him, pulling him into my arms. "Of course you are. Nothing will ever change that. But everyone's saying—" I cut him off. "I don't care what they say. You're mine. You'll always be mine." He clung to me then, sobbing into my shirt, and in that moment I swore again, just as I had the day he was born, that I would never let go. But outside our walls the world was merciless. At school, classmates whispered. Some teased him, others simply stared. He came home angry one day, throwing his backpack across the room. "They all know," he shouted. "They all think I'm nothing." "You're not nothing," I said firmly. "You are everything." But I could see the cracks forming in him the way they had in me. Doubt was eating away at us both. The hardest blow came at another family gathering. This time it was my nephew's graduation party. We hadn't wanted to go, but my wife insisted. "If we don't show up, they'll think we're ashamed." When we arrived, the air grew heavy. Conversations faltered. People shifted uncomfortably. At one point, my aunt, always blunt, never kind, pulled me aside. "Harold, why are you still doing this? Why are you humiliating yourself? Everyone knows he's not yours. Let him go." Her words burned in my ears. I turned away without answering, but the anger churned inside me like a storm. That night I sat alone once again in the garage, surrounded by relics of his childhood. The teddy bear missing an ear. The bike helmet still scuffed from his first fall. The baseball glove worn smooth from years of use. Every item told the same story. He was mine. Not because of DNA, but because I had been there for every moment, every laugh, every tear. But no one else could see that. To them, I was a fool. A man who had been tricked, who had wasted his life raising another man's child. And maybe I was. But when my son called out from upstairs, his voice trembling, uncertain, "Dad," I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would rather be a fool with him than a wise man without him. Nights are the heaviest. During the day there are distractions, work to do, errands to run, conversations to fill the silence. But when darkness falls and the house grows quiet, the weight of truth settles onto your chest like a stone. That night I couldn't sleep. My wife lay beside me, her back turned, her breathing shallow and uneven. Upstairs, my son's room was dark, but I knew he wasn't sleeping either. The silence between us all was deafening. So I slipped out of bed, padded down the hallway, and pushed open the garage door. The garage had always been my refuge, a place where the world's noise couldn't reach me. The scent of oil, sawdust, and old paint clung to the air. Tools lined the walls, neatly hung after years of habit. In the corner sat boxes of toys and keepsakes, small relics of my son's childhood, too precious to throw away. I sat in the old wooden chair, its legs creaking under my weight, and let the darkness wrap around me. On the workbench lay a dusty model airplane. We had built it together when he was 10. The glue had clumped, the wings tilted slightly askew, but he had been so proud when it flew, even if only for a few seconds before crashing into the lawn. I picked it up now, turning it over in my hands. My throat tightened. What am I to you? I wondered. Am I still your father, or am I just the man who stood in until the truth came out? Memories rushed in, uninvited. Him learning to walk, his tiny hands gripping my fingers for balance. His voice calling, "Higher, Dad," as I pushed him on the swing. The long nights when fever kept him awake and I sat by his bed, a damp cloth on his forehead. Each memory was a thread weaving us together into something stronger than blood. And yet doubt gnawed at the edges, because now everyone knew. The secret was no longer ours. It had a name, a weight, and it hung over us like a shadow that would never leave. I stared at the boxes piled against the wall. I pulled one closer, opening it. Inside lay a worn teddy bear with a missing ear, a pair of tiny sneakers, a birthday card scrawled with childish handwriting, "To the best dad ever." I pressed the card to my chest, my eyes burning. "I've always known," I whispered into the emptiness. The truth was I had. Not the proof, not the specifics, but the signs had always been there. The eyes too blue, the smile too sharp. The way people looked at us then looked away. I had known, and still I chose silence. Not out of cowardice, though some might call it that, but out of love. Because from the moment he was placed in my arms, screaming and red-faced, he was mine, and I would not let go. The garage clock ticked, each second loud in the silence. Midnight passed, then one. I sat there, speaking to the shadows as though they could answer. Does blood really matter? Is fatherhood measured in DNA? Or is it measured in scraped knees bandaged, in homework done at midnight, in sacrifices no one ever saw? I thought of my own father, a man who worked the fields until his hands bled, who never once said, "I love you," but showed it every day in food on the table and clothes on our backs. His blood ran in me, yes. But what I remembered most wasn't our resemblance. It was his devotion. And wasn't that what I had given my son? Around 2 in the morning, I heard soft footsteps. "Dad." His voice was small, uncertain, like when he was a boy afraid of thunderstorms. I turned. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the hall light, his hair tousled from sleeplessness. "Can't sleep?" I asked. He shook his head. Then, after a pause, "Can I sit with you?" "Of course." He crossed the room and lowered himself onto the old stool opposite me. For a while, just sat in silence, the clock ticking between us. Finally, he whispered, "Everyone says you're not really my dad." The words pierced me, but I held steady. "Do you believe them?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know, I don't want to." I leaned forward, my voice firm. "Listen to me, being a father isn't about blood, it's about showing up. It's about loving someone every day, no matter what. Have I ever walked away from you?" "No," he murmured. "Then don't you ever doubt it. You are my son, always." His eyes brimmed with tears. "I don't care what the tests say, you're my dad." I reached across the workbench, gripping his hand, and in that moment the storm quieted, at least for us. When he went back to bed, I stayed in the garage, staring at the model airplane, the teddy bear, the old sneakers. The truth was out. The world saw me as a fool, a man betrayed. But sitting there, surrounded by the relics of his childhood, I knew a deeper truth. I had not been deceived, not really. I had known, and I had chosen love anyway. The night dragged on, but I felt lighter somehow, because secrets no longer weighed me down. The world might judge, family might scorn, but in the quiet hours of that garage, I made peace with myself. I was his father, not because of blood, but because I chose to be. Communities are funny things. They can cradle you in love and support, or they can turn into a jury, judging every choice you make. When the DNA test became public, my community shifted overnight. I was no longer Harold, the hard-working man from the mill, the faithful churchgoer, the proud father. I became Harold the fool. Harold the man raising another man's son. And sooner or later they expected me to face their verdict. It happened at my nephew's graduation party, a week after the whispers had grown into open talk. The house was buzzing with chatter, balloons tied to every railing, tables laden with food. Music played, kids laughed, cameras flashed. But underneath it all was a current, an electric hum of tension. When my son and I walked in, conversation faltered. Heads turned. Some offered polite nods, others avoided my eyes. My wife stayed close to me, her hand trembling on my arm. My son shoved his hands deep into his pockets, his jaw tight. I could feel it, the unspoken weight in the room. Everyone was waiting. It started small. A few relatives cornering me near the punch bowl. Harold, one said softly, "You don't have to keep pretending." Another chimed in, "You've done your part, 17 years is more than enough." A third, sharper, "It's time you admitted it, he's not your son." My chest burned. I forced a tight smile, excused myself and walked away, but it didn't stop there. At dinner, the whispers grew louder, the looks more obvious. And then in the middle of the meal, my uncle stood up, his fork clinking against his glass. "Family," he said, his voice carrying across the table, "we need to speak plainly. Harold deserves honesty. We all know the truth now. That boy," he pointed at my son, "is not his. And Harold, it's time you stop living a lie." The room went silent. My son froze, his fork halfway to his mouth, his face drained of color. My wife dropped her gaze to her plate, her shoulders shaking. And me, for a moment I couldn't breathe. I looked around the table. Faces I had known my whole life stared back at me, some sympathetic, some smug, some simply curious. They were waiting for me to fold, to nod, to confirm their suspicions. I pushed back my chair slowly. The wooden legs scraped against the floor, the sound sharp in the silence. I stood, my hands trembling, my heart pounding. "You want the truth," I said, my voice low but steady. "Here it is." I turned to my son, his eyes, those damned blue eyes, were wide with fear, with shame, with a desperate need for me to claim him. "He is my son." Gasps rippled through the room. "No paper, no test, no whisper from the lot of you can change that. I have been his father every day of his life. I held him when he was born. I taught him to ride a bike. I worked my hands raw to put food in his mouth and clothes on his back. I sat by his bed when he was sick, cheered for him at every game, listened to every dream. I have loved him more than life itself." I took a step closer, my voice rising. "Blood doesn't make a father. Love does, presence does, sacrifice does, and by God I have given all three, so don't you dare tell me he isn't mine." For a moment, silence. Then a murmur. Some shook their heads, some looked away, but I didn't care. Because when I glanced at my son, his eyes were shining, not with shame, but with something else. Something stronger. He whispered, almost too quiet to hear, "Dad," and that one word drowned out every judgment in the room. The rest of the evening blurred. People avoided me after that, conversation stilted, laughter forced. Some relatives muttered under their breath. Others gave me pitying looks, as if I had chosen foolishness over dignity. But I held my head high, because dignity to me wasn't about what they thought. It was about standing by my son when he needed me most. Later, as we drove home, the silence in the car was heavy but different this time. My wife stared out the window, her face unreadable. My son sat in the back, quiet, but I could feel the shift in him. When we pulled into the driveway, he leaned forward, his voice soft. "Thank you." That was all he said, but it was enough. That night, I sat once more in the garage, the old teddy bear on my lap. The house was dark, the world quiet, but inside me a strange peace settled. The storm wasn't over. I knew that. There were still questions unanswered, still wounds unhealed. But for the first time in a long time, I felt steady. Because I had spoken the truth, the only truth that mattered. He was my son. And nothing, not blood nor betrayal nor the judgment of the world, would ever change that. Secrets have a way of slipping through cracks. No matter how tightly you seal the door, truth finds a way out, through whispers in the hallway, gossip at the store, or careless words from someone who doesn't understand the damage they cause. And when truth finally reaches the ears of the one you've been trying to protect, the pain is sharper than anything you could imagine. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. I came home from the mill, sweat clinging to my shirt, ready for nothing more than a shower and a quiet dinner. But the house was silent, too silent. I called out, "Son." No answer. Then I heard it, the faint thud of something upstairs. I climbed the steps and found him in his room, the floor littered with books and crumpled papers. His face was pale, his eyes red, his chest heaving. "What happened?" I asked, stepping inside. He glared at me, his voice trembling with anger and pain. "They told me." "Who?" "Everyone." He shoved a hand through his hair. "At school, my so-called friends. They said you're not my real dad, that I don't belong to you, that I'm a mistake." My heart shattered. I reached for him, but he stepped back, his hands trembling. "Tell me the truth, am I really your son?" The room seemed to tilt. I had imagined this moment countless times, rehearsed what I might say, but standing there, with his eyes boring into mine, eyes so full of fear and desperation, every word I had prepared vanished. "Yes," I whispered, "you are my son." He shook his head violently. "No, I mean, am I your real son? Am I your blood?" The silence stretched heavy and unbearable. I couldn't lie, not anymore. "No," I said softly. He staggered back as though I had struck him. His hands covered his face and a choked sob escaped his throat. I crossed the room, ignoring his resistance, and pulled him into my arms. He struggled at first, pushing against me, but I held firm. "Listen to me," I said, my voice breaking. "Blood doesn't make a father, I do. Every scraped knee I bandaged, every late-night project we finished, every game I cheered at, every sacrifice I made, that's fatherhood, that's love, and I have loved you with everything I am." He sobbed into my chest. "But if I'm not yours, then who am I?" "You're mine," I said fiercely. "You are mine. I don't care what the tests say, what the world says. You are my son, always." We stood there for a long time, his body shaking against mine. Slowly, his resistance melted and he clung to me as though I was the only anchor left in his world. "Dad," he whispered, his voice hoarse. And that word "dad" was worth more than blood, more than truth, more than anything else. Later, we sat on the edge of his bed. The room was a mess, papers and books scattered everywhere, but in that moment, none of it mattered. He wiped his eyes, sniffling. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to feel like this," I admitted. "I wanted to protect you, to let you grow up knowing you were loved without questions hanging over your head. But everyone else knew," he said bitterly. "Let them talk," I replied. "They don't know what we have. They don't know what it means to choose someone every single day, no matter what. That's what I've done with you. I've chosen you. And I'd choose you again 1,000 times." His eyes searched mine, hesitant. "You really mean that?" I cupped his face in my hands. "Son, listen carefully. You are the greatest part of my life. Not because of blood, not because of DNA, but because you're you. And I wouldn't trade you for anything in this world." Tears welled in his eyes again, but this time there was something else in them too, relief. That night, after he finally fell asleep, I sat alone in the dark hallway outside his room. My chest still ached. My eyes still burned, but for the first time since the truth had been revealed, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I couldn't control what people said. I couldn't erase the past. But I could give him one unshakable truth, that no matter what, he had a father who loved him beyond measure. And that was enough. There comes a point when silence can no longer hold back the tide. For years, my wife had lived behind it, guarding her secret with nervous smiles and quick changes of subject. But after the DNA test, after my son's tears, after my public declaration that he was mine, silence became impossible. One night, she finally broke. It was late. The house was quiet, my son asleep upstairs. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring into a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The clock ticked on the wall, each second dragging like a stone across the floor. She entered slowly, her footsteps hesitant, her hands twisted together, her face pale and drawn. For a long moment she just stood there, staring at me as though she didn't recognize the man in front of her. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I have to tell you everything." I didn't look up. "Go ahead." Her breath hitched. She sat across from me, folding her trembling hands on the table. "It was before we were married," she began. "I made a mistake. I was young, scared. I thought you would leave me if you knew. When I found out I was pregnant, I told myself it had to be yours. I wanted it to be yours, but deep down, I always knew." Her eyes filled with tears. "And when you held him for the first time, when I saw how much you loved him, I couldn't bring myself to say the words. I thought if I kept quiet, maybe it wouldn't matter, maybe love would be enough. She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. I was wrong, I was so wrong. I betrayed you, Harold, and I've been living with that guilt every single day for 17 years. I sat in silence, my hands clenched around the mug. I had imagined this moment so many times, her confession, her apology. I had rehearsed my reaction, anger, rage, accusations. But now that it was here, I felt empty. When I finally spoke, my voice was flat. Who is he? Her sobs quieted. She looked up, her eyes wide with fear. Please, she whispered. Don't ask me that. I need to know. She shook her head violently. It doesn't matter. He's gone. He hasn't been in my life since before we married. You're the only father my son has ever known. That's what matters. Her words twisted the knife deeper. I stood and paced the room, my hands pulling at my hair. You should have told me. All these years, you let me carry the doubt alone. You let me hear the whispers, endure the looks, defend him against the world while you stayed silent. Do you know what that did to me? Tears streamed down her face. I know, and I'm sorry. I can't undo it. All I can do is beg you not to hate me. I slammed my hand on the table, the sound echoing through the house. I don't hate you, but I can't forgive you, not yet. Maybe not ever. She flinched as though I had struck her. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Finally, I sank back into my chair, my head in my hands. You lied to me, you betrayed me, but the worst part is that you almost made me doubt my love for him. She reached across the table, her hand trembling. You've been a better father than I ever could have hoped for. He's yours, Harold, in every way that matters. Please don't let my mistake take that away from him. I looked up slowly, meeting her tear-streaked face. I won't, I said firmly. I won't let your lies destroy what I have with him. I may never forgive you, but I will never stop being his father. She broke down again, her sobs filling the kitchen, but I felt no comfort in her tears, because forgiveness, I realized, is not something you can give out of pity. It has to grow like a seed in soil, and right now the ground between us was barren. Later that night, I stood outside my son's room, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. I pushed the door open quietly, watching him sleep, his chest rising and falling in the dim light. He looked so peaceful, so unaware of the storm raging around him. And I knew more than ever that he was my anchor. No matter what his mother had done, no matter who his biological father was, he was mine. I returned to the garage, my sanctuary, and sat among the relics once more. The teddy bear, the baseball glove, the model airplane, all silent witnesses to the life we had built together. I thought about the vows I had made on the day of his birth when I held him in my arms and promised to protect him. That vow hadn't been broken. It never would be. Because fatherhood isn't about perfection. It isn't about truth without blemish. It's about choosing every single day to love, even when love feels heavy, even when it hurts. In the quiet of the garage, I whispered the words out loud as though saying them would make them stronger. I am his father, and nothing, not lies, not betrayal, not blood, will ever change that. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. I have carried this story for a lifetime. Through years of silence, whispers, accusations, and even betrayal, one truth has remained. I am a father, not because of blood, but because of love. And now, at 72 years old, I think it's finally time to tell you the whole of it. The world believes the DNA test revealed my secret, that I had been tricked, deceived, blindsided by a truth I never saw coming. But the truth is, I knew. I had known for years. It began the moment I first held him. They say a father looks for himself in his child, the shape of the nose, the curve of the smile, the color of the eyes. When I looked down at him that day in the hospital, I didn't see myself. I saw someone else's reflection in those blue eyes. But alongside that doubt, something else was born, a choice. I could have walked away. I could have demanded answers, demanded names, demanded justice. But in that fragile moment, with a tiny heartbeat pressed against my chest, I realized none of it mattered. What mattered was that he needed me, so I chose him. And every day after, I chose him again. When he fell and scraped his knee, I chose him as I lifted him into my arms. When he struggled with homework, I chose him as we worked late into the night. When he hit his first home run, I chose him as I cheered louder than anyone in the stands. When he called me dad with joy in his voice, I chose him all over again. The world may define fatherhood in blood, but I have learned something greater. Fatherhood is defined in choices, in presence, in sacrifice, in love that doesn't waver when the truth threatens to undo it. Yes, my wife lied. Her betrayal carved wounds that will never fully heal. But I refuse to let her mistake define me or my son, because my love for him has never been a lie. The hardest moment came when he asked me, "Am I really your son?" I wanted to scream, to rage at the world for putting that doubt in his heart. But instead, I told him the only truth I knew. You are my son, always. And I meant it, more than I've ever meant anything in my life. Now, when I look at him, grown, strong, with his own life unfolding, I don't see another man's child. I see the boy I raised, the boy I loved, the boy I chose. I see my son. Maybe you've lived through something similar. Maybe your family doesn't look like others think it should. Maybe love in your life has been complicated, messy, or filled with secrets. If so, let me tell you this. Blood is not the final word. Love is. Love is the bond that holds us when truth threatens to tear us apart. Love is the decision to stay, even when leaving would be easier. Love is the daily choice to say, "You are mine. I will not let go." And so this is my confession. I knew from the beginning. I carried the secret quietly, not because I was blind, but because I was determined. I chose love, I chose fatherhood, I chose him, and I would choose him again. 1,000 times, 1,000 lifetimes. Now to you, the ones who have listened to my story from beginning to end. Thank you. Thank you for carrying these words with me, for sitting in the silence, for walking through the storm. Stories like mine aren't easy. They're messy, painful, and raw. But maybe in some corner of your heart they remind you of the power of love. So tonight, as I close this chapter, I want to leave you with this. If you are a parent, love your children, whether by blood or by bond. If you are a child, cherish the ones who chose you, who stayed, who sacrificed quietly. And if life ever makes you doubt where you belong, remember this: love is stronger than blood. I wish you health. I wish you peace. And above all, I wish you the kind of family that chooses each other again and again, no matter what truths the world tries to reveal. Thank you for listening to my story. May your own story be filled with love.